The project we are presenting offers the possibility to investigate the topic of cultural transition that Nea Paphos underwent between Ptolemaic and Roman rule, following the developments across the imperial era up to the threshold of late antiquity. The architectural decoration of this complex turns to be particularly relevant. First of all, it allows the spatial and chronological definition of the changes the insula underwent. But equally important is the tracing of the development of Paphian architectural language in elite urban housing, and more generally in the entire island. In the House of Orpheus, a continuous sequence of layers from the early Hellenistic until late Roman periods gives the opportunity to distinguish at least 4 main stages of use of the entire excavated area, 3 of them defined as phases of gradual growth and development. The relative chronology is proposed to be correlated with the absolute chronology, for which the most important points of reference are not the political events, but rather earthquakes from which Paphos, as other cities of Cyprus, severely suffered. The first phase of the Orpheus complex gives a direct image of the houses belonging to the Hellenistic layout of the city. Small in size, each centered on a courtyard with a Doric peristyle, with adjoining rooms and entrances from the streets. The strong contacts with Alexandrian architecture result in the adoption of the Doric order and for colonnaded courts. The second phase, which at least includes the merging of 2 residential units of the house, is also characterized by the centrality of the Doric peristyle. It may be connected to the rebuilding activity just after one of the earthquakes of the 1st century BC or the 1st century AD. Instead, Ionic and Corinthian orders prevail during the third phase. It seems to be the period of the greatest flourishing of the insula, as well as the entire city. At that time, a new colonnaded courtyard was arranged in the southern unit 4, and elevations composed by Ionic and Corinthian orders accompanied the creation of a wider residence, derived from the merging of the 4 previous units. It seems that this great development of the house took place at the turn of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, as enhanced by mosaics as well as by architectural features. Finally, the 4th phase, related to the decreasing of the whole area, is characterized by the reuse of several elements that had become available for building purposes. So now we can start retracing these main phases through the analysis of the architectural decoration of the house. Given the richness of the context we are dealing with, for reasons of time, in today's presentation, we had to select the subjects, and we decided to focus on data just relating to the capitals. However, it is worth pointing out that significant transition processes can also be read through other elements of the architectural decoration that will be dealt with in future occasions. Even if the existence of buildings in the Hellenistic period is confirmed by archaeological evidence, Doric capitals undoubtedly attributable to that period had not been found in the House of Orpheus. In fact, in the only 2 examples on the site, a simplification of the canonical morphology had already taken place, according to a trend also widespread elsewhere in the Mediterranean, but with specific Cypriot characteristics. In order to facilitate the work process, as early as the end of the 1st century BC or the beginning of the 1st century AD, the common tendency became the replacement of the 3 annuli under the cainus with 1 or 2 fasce. The 2 capitals from the House of Orpheus show a conical echinus, slightly curved, still close to the Hellenistic models that are known, for example, from Amathus. But in the Agora of Amathus, other capitals show transformations according to a form widely spread in the Doric capitals of Paphian and Cypriot housing, so to be then named by G.R.H. Wright, Hellenistic Roman domestic Doric capitals. As for the examples from the House of Orpheus, we could attribute one of them to the plain drums that lay in the small peristyle of Unit 2 and in its surroundings, sometimes bearing traces of the original plaster coating. Moreover, a correspondence can be seen with a heart-shaped pillar that has engaged columns of the same diameter. These elements belong to the so-called Doric domestic architecture described by Wright. They can all be attributed to the second phase and dated to the end of the first or the beginning of the 2nd century AD. A further piece of evidence, still concerning the Doric order, points to the existence of entablatures protruding from the walls. A small pillar with an engaged Doric half column can be interpreted as a jamb, but also as part of an elevation deriving from Hellenistic architecture, whose continuity in Roman housing is attested elsewhere, as for example in Cyrene. Still to be referred to phase 2 are 4 fragments of simplified Corinthian capitals, coming from Unit 4, whose attribution to a specific sector of the complex is, however, much more difficult compared to the other capitals found on the site. These fragments probably derive from the cutting of the original capitals in pieces that could fit as building material in the masonry of a subsequent phase. On the base of their great dimensions, these fragments could enhance the existence of a hall opening onto the southern peristyle, whose entrance could have been monumentalized thanks to elevations that would have included this type of capitals. Now we can focus on the evidence connected to the 3rd phase of the site. It represents both the most documented in quantitative terms and the highest decorative level reached by the complex. Ionic and Corinthian capitals were included in the architectural elevation and, we shall say, became the protagonists of the monumental layout the house acquired at this stage. Most of the evidence comes from the southern sector, where we could recognize a section of an ambulatory with 2 blocks of the style of 8 in situ. Next to them, 2 almost complete fallen elements of a screen that are overturned allowed us to recognize a large peristyle. At least one of its ambulatories was closed by screens, with a molded side facing the corridor, as can be seen in the restored peristyle range of the Hellenistic house. Many other fragmentary screens, together with plain column drums and attic bases, lay in the proximities, with diameter of about 40 centimeters. This dimension corresponds to that of 4 four-sided Ionic capitals. They include a neck with a schematic scroll and have plain abacus and a straight channel ending with a well-drawn spiral. But these capitals are characterized by stylistic differences in their key components in respect to the Ionic canon. The stylistic framework of these capitals can be suggested by their comparison with the Ionic capitals in the peristyle of the nearby Hellenistic house, since these last are characterized by a different process of transformation of the Ionic form. We propose to date the capitals from the House of Orpheus to between the end of the 2nd and the beginning of the 3rd century AD at a contemporary moment with the Corinthian capitals of the house. These last are documented by some elements that had been reused in the walls of the previous Unit 3 and form at least 2 Corinthian capitals of columns and one of a pillar, of a bigger dimension than the above-mentioned Ionic elements. We propose that they originally belonged to a tripartite entrance of a reception hall that, at the present stage of the excavation, is not yet known. Hypothetically, we have placed it on the western side of the peristyle, where there are 2 large bases which can be attributed to the same Corinthian elevation, together with a pillar base and plain drums.
Please, okay? 2 minutes.
Okay. All elements that are bigger than the Ionic ones I was talking about before. The capitals belong to the free Corinthian type, that is, with water leaf volutes that originate directly behind the leaves of the lower rings without the use of stems and calyces. And I'm showing column capitals and pillar capitals here. These elements attest to the inspiration from the free Alexandrian Corinthian capital, but with profound transformations, especially in the rendering of the leaves. The same structural distortion of the acanthus appears in a specimen by the Odeon. Later, the widespread adoption of the simplified Corinthian capitals between the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century AD marks a breaking point with the Hellenistic architectural heritage in Cyprus. However, this heritage is not forgotten, but remains inscribed in an architectural culture in transit toward new solutions. The marbling of public building in the main cities of Cyprus from the Antonine Age onwards had one of its consequences in the renewed diffusion of local stone full-carved Corinthian and Ionic capitals. At that time, the traditional scheme of the free Corinthian capital was resumed, but the acanthus was replaced by forms influenced by the prickly Asiatic one. Similar outcomes of the same phenomenon can be found in Cyrenaican, in Corinthian capitals from domestic contexts. This moment might well be that of the construction of the so-called market building of Curium. The rendering of the Corinthian capitals of the House of Orpheus, together with the details observed for the Ionic capitals, and at the same time, the lesser value that the Doric orders assumes, represent the testimony of a crucial stage in the history of Cypriot architecture. As through a prismatic refraction, it reinterprets the past and external influences in original forms. Thank you.